Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my 5-minute Sarcoma Talk on OncoDaily. I'm, as always, your host, Shushan Hovsepyan, a pediatric oncologist by my training. And today, I have a very special guest joining me, Dr. Emily Slotkin, a pediatric oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Kids, specialized in treatment of children and young adults with sarcomas and other solid tumors. And today we are going to discuss a topic which is very near dear to me, desmoplastic small round cell tumors. Hello and welcome, Dr. Slotkin, and thank you for being with us today. And thank you. And let's just jump right in. Could you briefly explain what desmoplastic small round cell tumor is and what makes it distinct from other sarcomas?
Desmoplastic small round cell tumor is categorized as a sarcoma, but the cell of origin really has not been well defined. And so we sort of lump it together with lots of other mesenchymal tumors, but it has signs of differentiation from many different lineages. We think it's a tumor that probably grows first along the peritoneal lining of the abdomen, although there are cases of DSRCT that have arisen in very distant places from that peritoneal lining, so that also remains somewhat unclear. And it is molecularly characterized by the pathognomonic fusion between the EWSR1 gene and the WT1 gene, and most commonly arises in biologic males in the kind of adolescent and young adult population.
And what is the standard of care treatment right now for these patients? And what are the limitations?
The standard of care really has not been internationally well defined, but tends to usually involve highly intensive cycles of chemotherapy that is often borrowed from the treatment of Ewing sarcoma. So those usually involve cyclophosphamide, doxorubicin, vincristine, ifosfamide, etoposide have been sort of the mainstays of cytotoxic therapy. Patients who are amenable to surgical resection often are taken to the operating room to do as much debulking as possible, although the widespread metastatic nature of this disease often makes surgery difficult and complicated. And many centers do use some form of radiation therapy, whether it's consolidative whole abdomen pelvis radiation therapy or focal radiation therapy to unresectable areas of disease. So while there exists no true standard, usually some combination of Ewing-like chemotherapy, debulking surgeries, and plus or minus radiation, depending on where the patient is being treated. I think as I see it, the limitations of this really generally very toxic therapy can fall into two kind of major buckets. When you have a patient whose tumor is generally responsive to chemotherapy and can have operations and other consolidative therapies, then the main limitation of this therapy is apparently, because of the very, very high rate of recurrence, is apparently persistence of microscopic residual disease that then seeds recurrences that we eventually cannot fully eradicate, and patients die of a forward progression of these metastatic recurrences eventually. And so in this group of patients, I think the main limitation of our current therapy, in addition to its tremendous toxicities, are these pools of microscopic residual cells that must remain. And we don't fully understand why, even after highly intensive multiple cycles, surgeries and radiation, these cells are persistent. And that is one major limitation. And a second kind of category of limitations is applicable to different groups of patients whose tumors either never respond favorably to chemotherapy or have, by the nature of their presentation, such widespread or distant metastatic disease that can never be approached surgically. Then we have very few and, again, toxic ways of trying to administer local control. And the most classic place for this is in the liver. And so because of DSRCT's predilection to metastasize to the liver, there are many cases, unfortunately, where at presentation, the liver is almost nearly replaced with tumor. And in that case, everything we're doing is sort of going to ultimately fail because we cannot provide effective local control to the liver disease. And so that is a very different challenge than for the patients who start out with tumor that will eventually be possibly surgical resectable. So there are many different challenges in terms of reducing toxicities. And of course, like all the other sarcomas, trying to find systemic therapies that are even more effective, more targeted. However, with DSRCT specifically, I think you can categorize some of our limitations into these general problems. And then we're trying to therefore strategize what we can do for those groups of patients based on those like conceptual problems.
Yeah, that's it's very difficult to manage this kind of aggressive tumors. But let's discuss also the promising parts. As a leader of international clinical trials, almost all the trials that in desmoplastic small round cell tumor, I see that you are the PI of all the trials. What novel approaches are being investigated, and what is the rationale behind them?
So one particular approach that has been developed for several years here at MSK Kids is consolidative therapy, particularly for the abdominal compartment. And so using a radio-labeled antibody directed against B7H3 for the abdominal compartment, I think with successful administration, and we hope eventual completion of some of these trials, will help us do better at eradicating microscopic residual disease, at least from the abdominal compartment. And for the vast majority of patients who have the predominance of their disease in this compartment, this may be helpful. But I do think that in general, this still is going to provide relatively incremental benefit because it is compartmental and because it really is only even hypothesized to be effective for microscopic residual disease and not bulk disease. But I think is still important to pursue because of that first bucket of patients that we identified where they may have success with chemotherapy, surgeries, and radiation, but still experience recurrence. And so kind of understanding better how to eradicate unknown microscopic populations is important. We also have a trial coming sometime in 2025 with the Children's Oncology Group to evaluate the HER2-directed antibody-drug conjugate trastuzumab deruxtecan in this disease. We and others have noticed the high expression of HER2 in DSRCT, and we will be publishing soon our experience preliminarily with this off-label in DSRCT patients. But a formal trial will be very important to confirm this activity. And I think that in general, this type of approach, until we have maybe better targeted therapies that can even attack the fusion or can put together combinations of other medicines that are better at targeting this microscopic residual population, that this type of approach to the surfaceome and looking at relevant targets that exist on the surface of DSRCT cells and then using antibody-drug conjugates or other immunotherapy approaches to target them is probably going to be I think, the most helpful strategy within the next 1 to 2 years, 3 years, perhaps. And I think then at that point, the landscape of everything changes and will be different by then. But for the moment, with the agents that we have available to us for clinical testing, I am very enthusiastic about the ability of some of these antibody-drug conjugates to target the surfaceome of DSRCT. And it does seem that the surface of DSRCT is a little bit different from even closely related sarcomas like Ewing sarcoma. And for whatever reason, we may be having a little bit broader or maybe because of the multi-lineage nature of this, that we may be able to borrow agents from other adult onset cancers that will be relevant for DSRCT, where we haven't really had that luck so far with some of the other sarcomas that arise in younger people.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the promising drugs, but in your dream world where all patients with desmoplastic small round cell tumors would be treated, what would be the two most promising therapeutic strategies that you think, based from your experience, would be the ideal approach?
It's always changing and evolving all the time. And so I think that we know that given how aggressively this tumor behaves, and knowing that even with these extremely broad cytotoxic regimens, like aggressive surgeries and radiation, we still have recurrences. I do think that there probably will never be even a small group of agents that eradicates all of these cells unless there's such a significant advancement in our understanding of the biology of the tumor. So my sense is that for the foreseeable future, we will still need components of every one of these categories, but that we improve in each category so that then incrementally we end up with improvements in outcomes that we can actually measure and see. And so if, for example, that first category of patients who reach a radiographic remission but are ultimately going to experience a recurrence that they pass away from, if we had tools and strategies that we understood better would eradicate that disease, or our treatments to that point got us to a point where that microscopic residual amount is small enough that the immune system can take care of it, then I think those patients would eventually start to see improvements in their outcomes. And then the other category of patients for whom the current strategies are failing them, or our surgical strategies are not sufficient, we are going to be reliant on surgical colleagues and medical oncology colleagues that work with patients with liver metastases all the time to try to then approach, say, just the liver, for example, in the same way that we are thinking of the whole systemic disease. As, for example, we have surgical resection for one lobe. The other lobe remains, densely infiltrated with desmoplastic small round cell tumor. It has not been traditional to this point then to offer a surgical intervention. But I think if we don't push on that a little bit and say, can you help us do something with one lobe? We'll give some other therapies to the other lobe of the liver. Can we think creatively about any other strategies for this liver disease? That is probably what will possibly over time, like, move the needle in outcomes for those types of patients. So I think they're different enough in their challenges that they have to be approached in different ways. And the focus of those things are different. Of course, systemic therapy will also help those patients with liver infiltration or bony disease, but probably ultimately even a dramatically helpful systemic agent still will not be enough for those patients to eradicate that tumor. And therefore we need like additional better local control measures. So I think it will require a putting together of all of those elements, and they will need to be done in combination and probably differently depending on the way the patient presents.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very informative. And I always like the last question of my session. What inspired you to specialize in pediatric oncology and dedicate your career specifically to sarcoma patients? Because we know that they are the hardest difficult patients.
I work with a really wonderful group of other physicians here in MSK Kids, and I was a fellow here. And what eventually drew me to that group was just really wonderful experiences with them as a fellow, sharing patients with them when I was a fellow, and then just kind of becoming infiltrated on the service and enjoying working with those people. And then from there, like for many other people, it was sort of identifying a need within that community and knowing that that it was a little bit of a forgotten disease. And so there was there was a lot of space to be able to hopefully help these patients and make an impact in the overall treatment for this disease. And so that was the main reason. And I think now that I have done it for a little while and I'm on the other side of that decision, I think that the most interesting clinical and preclinical translational part of it is that there is so much space for exploration when you're dealing with a disease like DSRCT, where there are so many unknowns and the outcomes remain so poor. The questions that, from an intellectual perspective, the questions that you get to ask are really kind of fundamental and basic, and that can be satisfying if you're just trying to answer questions like, what drugs will work for this? How should we order therapies? And see some improvement. So I think, like many people, at a kind of a general evolution, but
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And this was very true, informative discussion. I know that desmoplastic is a very complex and aggressive disease, but still it's encouraging to hear that there is an ongoing research and innovation that could change the future for these patients. Thank you again for sharing your expertise and being with us today. And to our listeners, stay tuned for more episodes in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to OncoDaily on YouTube. Hit the bell icon to stay updated.